going to do today is go over the Snap-on Smile. This is going to be, definitely an introduction, but I'm definitely going to go into what you need to do to produce these. We're going to talk about kind of creating a work order through 3Shape. We're then going to jump into nesting, designing, nesting, talk about milling it and how you can kind of produce these and kind of some of the things I've ran into that were problematic. And then we're going to talk about kind of some do's and don'ts, pros and cons, kind of some things that that I've ran into over the years that hopefully we can kind of cut short your problems that you may experience, because there will be some learning curve. There is going to be some bumps in the road, but that's with anything we do, and hopefully we'll keep that down to a minimum. All right, so like I said, we're going to go through design, then how to mill, kind of talk about some of the things you can do to mill fast, to support it in there, to make sure you have success with that. And then we'll talk about delivery and kind of how to talk with the doctors and make sure that they understand exactly what they're getting. So the first thing here is kind of creating your work order. It's actually really simple through 3Shape. Over here, there's what's called the tabletop option. A few years ago, it was actually called the Snap-on Smile. And back then, of course, Snap-on Smile wasn't released to the public like it is now. And so it actually had, they kind of got told, don't call that Snap-on Smile. So they took it off, called it tabletop. So it's actually a choice made specifically in 3Shape to produce the Snap-on Smile. And so you'll choose that, you'll choose all the teeth that'll be involved. If there is a pontic, the missing tooth involved, you can make that part of the appliance, and you would just choose an anatomic pontic for that position. And then you'll splint them all together. You'll attach them. And then choose an opposing if there is an opposing, and have that. And that's really all you need to set up your work order. So next, you actually have to start to kind of design. Now, one of the things that you want to be aware of is, how difficult of a case is this going to be? And really what I mean by difficult is the amount of undercut, because that's what it comes to, is, the difficulty with these has a lot to do with the undercut that's presented. When we get crown or bridge cases, they're prepped. And sometimes doctors don't quite get them parallel, so there's a draw of a bridge, and the software can deal with that little bit of undercut, no big deal. With this, you're dealing with Mother Nature, and there's undercuts everywhere, and so you have to manage that. And there's a couple of ways that I'll show you later on to manage, but one way you can manage it from the get-go is to kind of create your path of insertion so that it's as ideal as possible for the anterior teeth. So what I mean by that is as you look down on this case, you would want to tilt this back so the anteriors have the easiest and most smooth path of insertion without much undercut. There's going to be some, but with as little as possible in the anterior. Leave that undercut to deal with in the posterior, because we have ways of dealing with that undercut where in the posterior you don't have as much aesthetic issues that you have to deal with as the anterior. So create your path of insertion so that it's as ideal as possible for those anteriors. Also, before you ever scan in the case, you can actually do some hand blocking with wax. So on some of those posterior teeth, when you see some major undercuts, go ahead and hand block out so that you create passiveness back there. Sometimes with the software, kind of helping it out a little bit makes the whole process go a little smoother. And I would also do the block out with a darker wax, and if you have texture scanning, that'll show so that you can know where you blocked out and where there's not any block out. All right, so what 3Shape is going to do, it's just like doing a bridge almost. You're going to go to each individual unit and mark it as to what that tooth number is, and then it'll create a tooth over top of there. You'll have these choices with tabletop. Kind of the defaults are actually fine. There's some die spacer and stuff in there, and that's actually not a bad idea, because up in the upper end of the tooth, the incisal or the occlusal of a molar, having a little passiveness there is good. Lets that tooth not be bound on and achy. Whereas you know, it just gives it a little pass. So those defaults actually work really, really well. And then down at the neck of the tooth where you don't have die spacer, it's nice and tight and will give you the retention you need. So if you look here, there's remove undercuts, this one here. Right? So what that basically means is if you click on this, that individual tooth, the software won't block out any undercut. If it does block out undercut, the problem you can have is it'll open a margin, right? So it's going to want to, you know, block out that undercut all the way down to wherever you mark your margin, and then it'll open it up. And if you go to save a margin, you'll wind up having like such a big step because it went down and blocked out, and then it saved the margin that you'll wind up having the mill just can't reach that undercut. It'll wind up kind of, this CAM software will kind of block that out, and now you got this case that just won't sit down. So, so that, you know, kind of where you want to lie. Now, keep in mind, you know, Acetal is also used to do partial frameworks, and with a partial framework, you usually have clasping, and there's 2, 3, maybe 4 clasps on a case, and that holds a partial in really well. So think about that with a Snap-on Smile. Now you're going over 12, 14 teeth. If you have retention on every single tooth, it's really overkill. You know, it's way more retention that's really needed. You're going to wind up having to relieve and grind so that the patient can actually get in and out. So what you can do is choose a few teeth around the arch. I don't know, 3, 4, 5, 6, depending on how much natural retention is presented as far as the undercut of those individual teeth. And so with that, choose a few teeth to have the software just block out and make passive, all right, where it's not going to affect the margin, or if it does, it's very slight, or it's back on the posterior. And then choose other teeth for the software to not block out the undercut. So the majority of the teeth will be blocked out. The minority of teeth, 3, 4, 5, 6, somewhere in that range, will have no blockout. So they'll have maximum retention. So that it's kind of placed around the arch and you get the good retention from those teeth and the passiveness from the others. And I'll show you here in a second how we kind of deal with those teeth that we are having blocked out and the others as well that aren't having any blockout. And then keep in mind too, if you have just extreme undercut on a tooth, you may want to, you know, really make the choice. And this is the part of this process that it's hard to teach or say, here's what it is, or it's this degree of undercut, because you know, the problem with these is, when it comes to that, is that it's Mother Nature. And every case is totally different. A tooth can have, you know, a small degree of undercut within a 3 millimeter movement down the neck of the tooth, or another tooth can have a huge amount of change in amount of undercut in 3 millimeter distance. So you really got to be picky and choosy, and really this is where it'll take some experience. I always tell people to you know, drift to the side of too much retention, because you can always grind with your hand with the model and adjust it into place and kind of learn from that, and then maybe do a little less next time until you dial it in, as opposed to not having enough and now the thing just falls off the model. So this is a really big part in having a successful fit, is the undercuts, and choosing those teeth, which ones to have retention and which ones to make passive and have the software block out the undercut. So once you place the teeth over top, all right, so this what I call ghost tooth, you sit it over top. One of your first inclinations is going to be to shrink that tooth down as absolutely small as possible, so that it just sits over top. And then you'll have a lot of the underlying tooth kind of poking through. And what'll happen is you'll get like these little cauliflowery kind of blobs that the software, once you mesh everything, will kind of make over top of that underlying tooth poking through. And those are I find a little difficult to smooth off and make look natural. Whereas if I make the tooth bigger so that there's very little of the underlying tooth possibly poking through, and then after that, I shrink things down. Once it's accepted, I shrink things down a little bit. For me, just seems to be a little bit of a smoother process. You could try both ways and experiment. Both ways work. It's just I choose to kind of put these teeth over top so that there's definitely not much of any tooth poking through. All right, so once you put those teeth in place, it's now going to create a margin for you. And generally, it'll create that margin right at the neck of the tooth. It finds that crease, and that's where it places it. What you wind up happening is if you have a tooth like this, and this being the margin, and this is the occlusal of the tooth, right? This is the most extreme undercut. So if you have both margins marked into that undercut, that software, that CAM software, is going to have a hard time dealing with that if you tell the software to not block out the undercuts. So now you're going to have this, and that CAM software, even if you have a nice degree, of 5-axis mill, it's going to have a hard time getting in there. So the CAM software will block it out, and now you'll have this case that just won't go down. If you have it block out the undercut, right down, now you're going to have an open margin. If you will look here on my cursor, here's the height of contour here, probably right around that area. Right, so if the software blocks out, it's going to block out down to probably about here at my best guesstimate. Right, so if you have your margin marked in here, it's going to have a wide open margin there. Whereas if we overextend our lingual margin, now it can block that out and still be sealed to the model. So there's no gap there, no food trapping, no playing with it with their tongue or any of that. Okay. On the facial, we also have to kind of be wary of that gap, rubbing on their cheek, food getting caught. But what we can do there is actually bring the margin up the tooth. Right, you can do that on the facial as well. Back in those posterior teeth, where aesthetics isn't as big of an issue, patients most likely won't show. You can do away with some extreme undercuts by bringing the margin up the tooth. There's been times where I've had like the 2 molars, literally just a occlusal cap on there, so that we hold those opposing teeth in place and there's no movement, and they can biting area for chewing and everything. So either overextend your margin to deal with undercuts, or underextend your margin so that you can deal with those undercuts. So 2 different ways you can go about helping your software deal with these undercuts. And really, software can create anything. It's the mill that can have issues getting exactly what you created in software to mill out and actually fit down on the model. All right, so once you've marked that margin, whether you've overextended or underextended, you then will mesh the teeth you placed to that margin. And this is very similar to what you do with crown or bridge. So there's nothing crazy there. It's just that margin marking. There's no, there's no margin been created by the doctor. So in that, you want to, you can kind of play with things to make it more ideal. And again, in the anterior, we can't really bring a margin up the tooth, because when they smile, you'll see this line and this differentiation between materials. So with the posterior teeth, we can. So that's why we wanted to make that path of insertion as ideal as possible for those anteriors, so they have very little undercut, if any at all. And then in the posterior, we can deal with those undercuts and change things from there. So you can see here, this is a lower. Lowers are always easier than uppers. If you want a doctor is going to do one of these to open bites, try to talk them into doing it on the lower, because there's just less undercut just with the morphology of the teeth. Usually you'll have a pretty good undercut in these premolars that you can deal with pretty easy. Those anteriors are a biggie that's way different than the maxillary. It's still, of course, very possible with the maxillary, but you'll definitely have an easier time with the lower. You can see it was very little blockout. You can see the crease on these. Most teeth had retention. I was electing to just adjust it to place, so because there's just not a crazy amount of undercut as far as this case is involved. All right, so you can see here it creates the margin. I do like to fatten up those marginal areas just a little bit. This material grinds beautifully for any of you that haven't worked with the acetal. So taking a rubber wheel to it, you can smooth it and adjust it in 2 seconds. It just grinds almost like acrylic. So you can bulk things up a little so that you don't get movement during the milling process at the margin, as well as if you do wind up having to relieve some underside to get the fit, you have some material to work with there. You're going to punch a hole through. And then again, just like with anything, as you get better, get some experience, you can definitely start to push those limits and get things more closer to the finished product coming right out of the mill. Well, I would recommend at least for a while, that if at all possible, have the design person either finish these or sit with the person who does finish them. You will be really surprised at how much those designs will be better once they start to see what the finisher will have to deal with. Because there's no doubt about it, there's going to be finishing involved. You're going to have to put your hands on these coming out of the mill. You know, because you're dealing with Mother Nature, and they're just always so different. Some of them will drop right down. You'll touch it here and there, you know, define the interproximals, and boom, it's ready for polish. Other ones you'll sit for 5-10 minutes trying to get it to fit, adjusting here and there so that you have enough retention, but not too much. The material comes right now in A1, A2, A35, B1, and G2. G2 is a bleaching shade. It's kind of in the middle of the road when you look at, you know, a 3D shade of bleaching versions like the OM1s, 2s, 3s. It's right in the middle there. If you compare it to like an Ivoclar, you know, bleaching shade, it's kind of in the middle of that range. We're hoping to have an A3 soon, as well as a C shade. We would have hoped to have those out already, but I think with everything going on, it's kind of delayed those shades coming out. Okay, so at this point, if we're able to, I'll usually open up so that I can hear you guys. We'll see if that goes smooth. Sometimes there's too much background, and see if there's any questions that anybody has.
Hey, Kris. So as of right now, we haven't had any questions come in, so feel free to just continue.
All right. So we will, I will periodically stop for questions, and you can submit those questions through your information bar. You can type them in, and then when we stop, I'll be able to read those, or I think usually they'll read them to me, the person who's running it. So we should be in good shape there. So nesting, milling, not anything too tricky, but there is a few things that are easy things to do that make a huge difference, right? So if you were today to say, hey, I would like to mill one of these tomorrow morning, you can have the acetal material and you can mill it using Pmma strategies and Pmma tooling. It'll mill it just fine. We have found that most mills are relatively slow at milling it with those tools and strategies, but it'll get it done just fine. We do have some companies out there like Sierra Tools that has developed tooling as well as strategies that are specific for our material that dramatically speed up that process. So with a Roland, Pmma tooling and Pmma strategies, what you see here would probably be a 2.5 to 3 hour, maybe even a 3.5 hour mill job. With some single flute, 3mm, 2.5mm tooling with the specific strategies. With that, probably get this down to 1.5 hours and somewhere in that range. So we're cutting that time at least in half, if not more. So if you want to get going on this right away, Pmma tools strategies will be just fine. If you feel like you're going to put this in production, definitely give Greg at Sierra Tools a call and get set up with some of that stuff so that you're efficient with it. And that also goes for if you're milling acetal for frameworks or long-term temporaries or anything like that. All those tools, of course, will work to mill our material, whichever kind of appliance you're producing. So that's the first thing when it comes to milling these. The second thing is the support pins. All right, the support pins are very important. You know, I don't care if you put a 2 or a 3mm support pin on these, you just gotta put a lot of them. You know, I usually use like a 1.5mm. I think the one I use is like a 2 tapering down to a 1 with my Millbox cam software. With my VHF software, I use their 1mm, I think it's 1 or maybe it's 2mm support pin, or 1.5. The size of the support pin isn't necessarily the most important. It's the volume of them that you place. Like this case here is not enough. I'd like to see a support pin on, you know, between the facial and the lingual to see 1 per tooth. So I'd like to see one here, and then maybe one here, then one here, because this material has flex to it. It'll have movement to it. But while it's in this mill, in this puck, we need to have it rigid and solid, especially if you're pushing the speed and the power of the mill and those single flute type milling tools. Really got to keep that thing stable and not flexing away from the tool. On this outer edge, we can really, with a lot of our softwares, really sneak this up to the edge. Got to be careful because this can become a little flexible and unstable. So if you have, you know, some of the holders for different mills totally encompass the puck and engage it, and it's going to keep it stable, and you can scoot that over about as far as you can and put support pins there. If you have a holder that has open ends, you know, just kind of clamps here and here, and it's kind of open, I would scoot this in a little bit so you may have more of a thickness of material here. Or if you're really trying to stick two in here and you want to put it up against the wall, you may put more support pins here, put some on the outer edge. It's a little bit of a risk, but not put any support pins here so it can mill that and it won't be affected by any flexing that happens on the outside. So just a couple of things really, if you know, I tell people, if you think you put enough support pins, put two more. You know, it doesn't really take more time in your mill. You know, it's a little bit more you got to snip off, but this material grinds like acrylic, so it's just not a big deal to, you know, to put as many as possible to keep that stable. And so that's when it comes to milling, that's the two things is, you know, try to be efficient with it, look into some of the strategies and tooling that are specific for these materials. And then the support pins, I can't say that enough. Definitely have had a few calls with people with bouncy appliances and ill fits, and that seemed to be the issue, was that just they weren't supporting it properly and it was just moving around while it was milling, which just made for a warped appliance. One little hint that I will give you, you know, there's different reasons. There's this reason that you could get an ill fit. You know, you could have a new person come in, even if you're doing it right for a while, that comes in, doesn't know, doesn't support it right, and all of a sudden you got a bouncy case. Let's say you did a case and the doctor says it's bouncing in the mouth, takes a new impression. Sure enough, it's bouncing on that new model from the new impression. It was a bad impression from the get-go. You know, you hate to have to redesign, remill, and go through that. One fix for this material that works nice is to clamp it down onto the model. If it flexes down into place and has a good fit once it flexes into place, clamp it down. I use those big alligator clips for in the office, those big spring-loaded kind of clips, and I'll clip it down so it stays in place. And then I'll put it into a toaster oven. It's funny, but a toaster oven. Set it at about 300 degrees. You want to do little test cases because toaster ovens aren't the most sophisticated, the most accurate in the temperature that they're telling you. Put it in there, let it run up to 300. Once it hits 300, let it sit there for about 5 minutes and then turn the oven off and just let it cool down with the oven. And usually that will, you know, heat that material, make it slightly formable, which will form it to that new model. And when you take those clips off, it should be fitting nice. So just a little thing to think about because we're all going to run into that. Nothing is perfect, whether it be after it's been tried in or even coming out of the mill when something went awry. That's a nice fix. So again, checking to see if there's any questions that they've developed as far as anything before or nesting and milling.
Kris, I did see a couple of questions come in.
Okay.
So let me just pull these up here. Do you recommend to open the occlusal table of the posterior crowns for the Snap-on Smile?
Yep, great question. So yes, you're almost always, 99% of the time, going to have to open up the bite to do one of these. 0.8 to a millimeter seems to be the spot where you can still have enough material that it's strong. You might see some pictures of some cases where they have these open occlusals. I don't like that. You know, food gets jammed in there. They're weaker. The appliance in general is weaker because of that. So I like to have a full occlusion, maybe with some holes here and there of a kind of a high cusp that tends to poke. You let it poke through, that's fine. But as far as opening up a whole occlusal square on the individual teeth, I don't like that. But so yes, the answer to your question is most cases you'll be open 0.8 to a millimeter.
Perfect. Okay, next question here is from Matt. When marking margins interproximally, should they intersect or stay apart?
Yeah, so when marking the margin, I do like to see daylight between them. If you overlap them, you'll get these errors that'll come through where of course, it'll make the material too thin. You'll get these errors that your appliance is too thin in that area. So give yourself 0.5 millimeter or so gap. Once you actually create, it's in that interproximal, it just hides it. It's like it was never there, so you can get yourself space and not really affect the look or fit of it in any way. So yes, have a gap there.
Thanks, Kris. And then just 2 questions from Isaac. The first, can you explain the advantages of the acetal over standard Pmma?
That's a really good question. Guys, definitely don't be afraid to ask questions because these are all really good. And sometimes when you work with a material day in and day out, it really helps for someone like me to remember some of the more kind of basic questions. So good question. Yeah. So the acetal resin is much stronger, has better wear characteristics. You're looking at from, the Pmma is a fairly rigid material. This has some flex to it. So the strengths don't 100% correlate, but most people say it's probably about 8 to 10 times stronger in most of the ratings as far as, tensile strength and notch izod and all these different ways that you can judge the strength of something. It gives where others would crack and break. The flex of the material also allows it to go into some of those undercuts where with Pmma, you just have very little movement. So you have to have a more passive kind of fit and some things like that. So it's also much more healthy, right? So this material doesn't absorb any moisture. So these generally be used like a partial. Patients will take them out at night, wear them during the day, and they're going to be eating with them and different things. So they got to be, stain resistant. Nothing can absorb into it. Even smell. This material won't absorb the saliva because with saliva comes bacteria, stains, and smells. So it won't have any of that. So it's much better wear, much stronger, and will be kind of healthier being in the mouth and stay cleaner over the long term.
And the second question from Isaac, Kris, do you have an example where you want to leave occlusal open with holes so we do not touch the bite?
Yeah, it's almost impossible not to touch the bite. Unless you have huge gaps and spaces on the opposing, like missing teeth where you can run over the occlusion with a larger volume of material, then maybe you could kind of do that and have the bite settle in. But if you have most of your dentition, you can't run, like when we do flippers, we run a little ball clasp wire through and that barely fits through. You can't put a little stream of this material, a little, wire, small gauge little bit of material. It's just going to break, and the flex and it, this material is, it's very strong and everything, but it has to have some resilience to it. It has to have some material there to be strong. And so, yeah, it's unless you have big gaps and spaces where you can run a good ribbon or strap of this material over, you're almost always going to have to open that bite, especially on a lower. The lower, you'd wind up, those anteriors bite into the linguals of the uppers. You have those incisal edges of those lowers showing through. It would just look, it just looks silly and just wouldn't make sense. So you always have to open up that occlusion.
Makes sense. Okay, last 2 questions before we continue. From Samantha, in mailbox, what object type do you put these in as?
I'm sorry, what was that one more time?
In mailbox, what object type do you put these in as?
Yeah, so you can put it in as crowns, and that seems to work out pretty well. I've experimented with putting it as a bite split, and it seems to be a little faster mill job with a little less definition. But that being said, if you do upgrade to the tooling and the new mill strategies, it kind of doesn't make that much of a difference. So if you ask me, put it in as a crown and bridge case.
Okay, and last question for now. Can you mill 1 or 2 teeth past the last tooth like a denture saddle?
Yeah, so you can have a free end extension with these. I would, you can make the pontic, so they'd be essentially a cantilever pontic or a free end off of a partial is the concept. What you can do is actually make those pontics relieve from the ridge a millimeter or two. I'll actually show you a case in a bit that's kind of like that. And then you can drill some holes up in those pontics and actually process acrylic there and make a flange so that as the patient chews and they have pressure, you know, it's going to flex and move a little bit. It'll give it a bigger footprint so that it's less stress on that ridge. And then they can do relines and stuff in the future as well, because if you have that acrylic on there, and it's all mechanically bonded on, there's no chemical bond. But mechanically bonded on, it can do real well.
Got it. All right. Thanks, Kris.
All right, great. Sure. All right, so to continue on with kind of, we talked about heating up the appliance so that it doesn't have a bounce. There's another, instance where you may, like this case here is a good example of where you would have to do a repair. So this case was done when we injected them, right? So this is before there was millable materials available. And what would constantly happen, this is 4 pontics, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are all pontics, all right? So this is an abutment tooth, and then this is an abutment. The rest of these are abutment teeth. And typically the acetal has a good bit of shrinkage, kind of like metal with our crown and bridge metals. And we have a high expansion investment for the metals to counteract that. We had a special stone, but when you had thicker areas and thin areas, you'd get a little warpage. And just like with crown and bridge, where we would cut the metal and resolder it, you could do that with the acetal. So let's say a doctor, same situation, impression wasn't quite good or something, and it's huge bounce, and the oven deal that I was talking about doesn't quite cut it. Can actually cut it, place it down on the model, fill that in with wax, do a putty matrix establishing that wax that you placed. Then using the hot shot gun. So the hot shot gun melts and injects the acetal. The acetal, which is the Duracetal, is very similar, basically the same material as our pucks. And so they will melt to each other. And so we will heat it up in the hot shot gun. It's kind of like an oversized glue gun or a caulking gun. And then you'll inject a blob into that spot. And then you'll take your putty and just smash it down into place. That'll push it into the finer details and kind of let the molten materials kind of melt together. If you go on to Myerson's YouTube channel, there is some videos of using the hot shot to repair Duraflex, Duracetal, VisiClear, all the different materials. The processes are all the same no matter what the material is, so you can get a little visual of that if you would want to know more about that, kind of the more entirety of that process. And then you'll have a blob of material that you'll clean off, and then here it is. There's no line of demarcation. There's just a melt, between the materials. And so here's the example. I drilled retentive holes up inside these pontics and then processed this acrylic to that saddle. This is all mechanical, but you can do that in a lot of different instances. Right? We also have a high shine material. Denture, regular denture high shines will work okay, but they are just the acetal one is a little bit more. I don't know how they make it or why it's so good, but it does give more of a mirror shine. Really gets a much higher shine when you use that block, and it'll last you forever. So I'd recommend, if you're going to do them, get that. It actually works really good on your acrylics as well. It's a pretty nice polishing high shine material. And so when you do polish it, you'll still have microscopic tooling marks when you look under the, microscopic, when you look under a microscope, you can really see the tooling marks. You'd want to pumice, or we do have a polishing kit. Again, on Myerson's YouTube channel, you'll see a video I did polishing Duraflex. Again, it's the same process. And there's a polishing kit we have that has a yellow, red, blue, green bristle brush. There's rubber bristles, and those are embedded with an abrasive that will get out the surface scratches and tooling marks, and then high shine. Don't think you can pull it right out of the mill and just high shine it. It won't give you that nice brilliant look. You're really going to prep that surface before you high shine. All right. So one of the last things we'll talk about is, this material is really nice aesthetically. All right. Now, I will preface that. We want to make sure that the patient knows what they're getting. They have expectations that are, make sense. Also, the doctor needs to make sure that their expectations are accurate as to what this appliance is. You don't want a patient going to the doctor and saying, well, I want to correct my teeth. And he goes, okay, well, we can do veneers for $15,000, or we can do this Snap-on for $2,000. Oh, let me do that Snap-on. Well, they're not the same thing. Very different. There's a reason that there's different cost. So the way I kind of lay it out to a doctor who's inquiring about these appliance, Snap-on appliances and hasn't dealt with them before is I say, if you take a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being, very deteriorated, discolored, ugly smile, and 10 being the most beautiful smile. If a patient is a 6 or a 7, I'm sorry, if let's say they're a 5 or a 6, and we get them up to a 7 with this appliance, they're not going to be happy. If they're a 5 or a 6, we need to do veneers and get them up to a 9 or a 10 for them to be excited and happy about the appliance. Now, if a patient is a 1, 2, 3, 4, and we can get them up to a 6 or 7, now they're going to be a patient that's crying in the chair, right? They're going to be ecstatic with this appliance. So I think aesthetically, that's where the range should be. And I think you've got to make sure you educate your doctors. So the doctor educates the patient, so you don't get a case returned to you saying the patient just refused it, doesn't like it. So just be careful with that. Now, the second use of this, other than aesthetic, advantages, is kind of restoring verticals. You can see this patient here. This is a Kois doctor, trained under Dr. Kois. And so the doctor placed the patient in a Kois deprogrammer, which is kind of like an NTI device where it reestablishes their vertical. And then he sends me a bite he established from that to create the Snap-on here, which we open them up, I don't know, 3 millimeters, somewhere like that. Right? And you can kind of see the difference before and after repositioning. Now, the patient could wear this, and every few years have it replaced, depending on how hard they are on the appliance. Could last 5 or 6 years, could last, a year or 8 months. It just depends how they take care of it and how, they wear on it and the foods they eat, and just a lot of things you all know about that. Or the patient could say, well, I like this, but, I have to take it out every night and food gets caught, and I'd rather, get this done permanently with crowns. And it kind of gives them the confidence that the repositioning makes their jaw pain go away, or their headaches, or whatever it might be. And so what the doctor can do is actually create their own payment plan. And what I mean by that is, let's say the patient's ready to go with this. Section it here, remove this piece of 3 teeth, prep, prep, prep. Now, scan or take the traditional impression with the rest of this still in. So then now the lab has this, vertical the doctors work so hard to establish. The lab can mount using that to create the 3 crowns. And once he's prepped, he can fill this piece up with temp bond or acrylic and put it back in as the temporary. Right? And then 2 weeks later, however long, crowns come back. Doctor places these crowns, and the patient just wears this piece while those crowns are in. They save money, they wait for the insurance, whatever it might be. Right? Then a year later, 8 months, whatever it is, section it here, prep, prep, prep. Same process. They can work their way around the mouth. If, let's say just those anteriors are left, sometimes they can be limited in retention. You can use like a denture adhesive inside. It'll create a suction and actually does pretty good if it's going to be, temporary and not too long. If you ever run into that, denture adhesive can be something that can be used just to hold it in there until they get through this process. So it's a really nice tool for a lot of that to really establish a new vertical, whether they stick with it or they transition over to crown or bridge. Again, you can punch holes through here and there. I don't like the big windows open. We'll kind of end on this case. This is a bit of a hybrid. We have 3 anterior teeth that are broken down but healthy, and 2 crowns back here. Now, what the doctor wanted was to kind of see what we could do, and I was like, well, can we crown these? No. Can we put implants in? No, can't afford that. We pretty much can afford it partial. And so what I came up with was this. All right, so we have pontics and then shells over those anteriors, like a Snap-on. We actually put rests and clasps on these teeth. She actually bit into these and actually had to slide protrusive to actually make lingual contact with these. If she did in centric make contact here and on the lingual, it could have opened a window here. So she bit through to her natural bite. So in this instance, we could actually leave the occlusion without opening anything. Doctor felt like there may need to be a reason for relines in the future. So we wanted to process denture teeth and acrylic to the back so that the acrylic's there available to do the reline. We get retention from these teeth as well as the anteriors, just sitting over those copings. Here it is at try-in, and here it is finished and polished up. So you can see, you know, the patient got what basically crowns would give them in covering those teeth and straightening them, making them look better. They could have chose a lighter shade because we're covering up almost all the teeth, as long as it didn't clash too bad with the lower. And we give them a partial so they can eat. So it's a, you know, gives you multiple uses of this appliance. And, you know, definitely for a lab, it should be a premium, you know, processing fee, but it won't be a bill to the doctor near as much as what crowns or implants and a partial would be. So to end, I want to kind of talk about what an ideal case would be. All right. So slightly discolored teeth, you know, we can cover them up with a lighter shade that will be, you know, won't have that discoloration. Broken down, cracked, but healthy. That's the big thing. We don't want to cause more problems than we help by covering up, you know, some teeth that are in bad shape. Collapse of vertical dimension, we can open them up into a healthy position. And then small teeth are really ideal, right? Because when you need teeth, this is going to give you more thickness. So you're going to get bigger teeth. And when you have smaller teeth, we can really make that smile full and nice. Now, challenging cases, we got to manage those expectations, you know, starting with the doctor. So the doctor then passes that on to the patient. Diastemas. Down here, she had little teeth. So making those diastema and covering up, the teeth didn't look big, but what will happen is that the teeth will tend to look really big. With crown and bridge, we can kind of shift midlines to kind of share that. With this, we really can't, because we can't really put a midline in the middle of a tooth. We don't have a room. So diastemas can be a challenge. So dark teeth. She has some darkness, but I would say that if the facial of the tooth can be 0.8 to a millimeter thick, you're probably going to block out any darkness showing through. If you get down to like 0.6, 0.5, which you can with this material, you'll see some of that darkness showing through. Clinically jeopardized, right? So they've got to be healthy. We don't want to cause more problems, you know, in the end than we help. Large teeth are going to get bigger. So sometimes it's a nice idea to receive a picture of the patient so that you can visually see the size of the teeth as it relates to their face. Sometimes teeth don't look big, but a patient can be super small and dainty, and we make them even bigger and they just look too big. So sometimes a little picture to come in, just like you see here, just a snap of them before the appliance is good. And then gummy smiles. For whatever reason, when patients have a big, high smile line, you show a lot of gum, they're ultra sensitive to seeing these and tend to have more of an issue than just people who have kind of a more normal lip line. I don't know why that is. I mean, I guess it's just more upfront, you know, the smile. But you want to be wary of that whenever recommending one of these. All right, so we can open it up for one last batch of questions, and then we'll be done and ready to cut you guys loose.
Thanks, Kris. We actually only had just one more question come in, which is, what is the most popular shade?
Yeah, I think it's just like anything else. It's at A2. A1 and A2, you know, some, if we're going for the normal shade, it's A2. And then every once in a while they want to go light to the A1. And then you will get the bleaching and the B1s in there. But most of these patients are, you know, like you see in this picture here, you know, have probably a C3 or 4, and they want to go to a lighter, brighter shade. But this is probably an A1 or an A2, and they tend to not go crazy with it. So that's what I found is probably that A2, A1 range are the most popular.
Got it. Okay, and actually we did have one more question sneak in, so we'll close with this one. Can the material wear away enamel? Patient wearing acetal snap-on. Lower is not snap-on?
No, so this material is super kind to a dentition. The reason that it's more wear resistant is because it's slick. The denseness of this material doesn't allow for there to be friction built upon it. So it's not like it's super hard, and that's why it's wear resistant. It's actually wear resistant because the teeth just kind of slide over it. So it will do nothing to opposing dentition. The only thing I have found is if the posing, let's say, is a crown of bridge, and that crown of bridge had been adjusted at some time and never really polished back again, so it has a little bit of a sandpapery kind of dullness to it. I've seen that wear on the acetal because then that was able to gain friction. So, be wary of that. But as far as it wearing on any denture teeth or porcelain, no, it won't have any issue on that.
Great. Okay, well, I think that includes the questions for today. If anybody has any additional questions, feel free to reach out to Kris, or you can email us at zahn@henryschein.com, and we're happy to follow up with you. And just as a reminder, this webinar will be posted on demand on YouTube and on our website by tomorrow.
Yeah, and one thing I would like to add, just so you guys understand that, Snap-on Smile is a trademark, and what Meyerson's done is created the LTD pucks. And the LTD pucks are a 22 millimeter puck that are specifically for the Snap-on Smile. And just know that if you purchase the LTD pucks and become certified, which you can talk to your Zahn rep to kind of find that out, but really viewing this webinar, and that's really about all you've needed to do to become a certified lab, you can then order the pucks. The pucks aren't any more expensive than a regular acetal, right? So they're priced exactly the same. It's just a way for Meyerson to monitor the sales, because they do have to pass on a royalty to Denmat, who's the owner of the Snap-on Smile trademark and process. So just know, don't think because it's the Zirlux Acetal LTD that all of a sudden they're going to mark that thing up so that you can say that it's a Snap-on Smile. No, you can say it's Snap-on Smile once you're certified. You can make these advertise. We can help you with some advertising literature and pictures. And the pucks are exactly the same as any other seals, just so Meyerson can monitor the purchasing. So, don't be wary of that. I want to make sure that that's understood.